Good morning. You can be opening your Bibles to Ruth chapter 4. Normally on Sunday nights, I've been preaching through the book of Ruth, but I wanted to finish up the book of Ruth on a Sunday morning as we look at chapter 4 of this very short book. So as you turn your Bibles there, I just want to welcome everybody. It's good for my family and I to be back. We were on vacation in Florida, had a very relaxing time there. But it's good to be back with everybody here. Every time we come back into town, we're just happy to be here. It feels like home so quickly to us. And so thank you guys for embracing us like you have and for your kindness towards us. One of the things that the Bible teaches is that God can take whatever trials and difficulties you're going through and use them for His glory and also ultimately for your good at the same time. That those two things can exist at the same time. His glory and also your good. And since I've been a Christian, I can think about different people who have gone through very challenging circumstances. And the way that they handled those challenging circumstances by their trust in the Lord, by their concern for those around them still at the same time, it's inspired me to think about how is it that I'm going to handle future trials in my life. And perhaps you could all think of somebody in your life that you've seen, godly person, go through something difficult, and the way that they did it taught you something. And all of those people that we could think about and name and recall the stories, if we were to interview those people and say, hey, what helped you get through these things the way that you did with such grace? They would probably say some kind of story or some passages from the Bible that served as encouragement for them during the time of difficulty that they went through. God has given us so many great things in Scripture. He's given us so many great promises in Scripture that give us buoyancy, whatever that word would be, you know what I mean? Strength through the midst of difficulties. And I think the book of Ruth is one of those. And rather than getting into all of the details by way of reminder of what we've been looking at, I'll just keep this really simple. When we get to Ruth chapter 4, we're looking at two widowed women, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. And in this society, the only way that these women are going to be taken care of is if the younger one, who's of marriageable age, is able to find a husband that will provide the needs for them to continue to live and not have to keep working in the fields and everything like that. Where is their rest going to come from? And to this point in Ruth chapter 3, we've found that Ruth has gone and proposed to the man who is older but could take care of them. And we left chapter 3 with a cliffhanger because there's another man who is more eligible to marry her. And if he accepts it, then great, she's still going to get help. But as readers of this book, we all want the help to come through this man named Boaz. Because this is the man we've been reading about. It would make a great little love story if it would come through this man named Boaz. And so in chapter 4, we're going to see the plain land, and we're going to see God take care of this needful situation. So as we begin in chapter 4, we're going to look at the first 6 verses, and we're going to read about the negotiations that took place between these two potential suitors and how Boaz ends up being the one that marries Ruth. Look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. 1 through 4, let's start out with. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken, that's the other guy that could marry Ruth, came by. So Boaz said to him, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 2 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Now in this first 4 verses here, they're at the city gate. And at the city gate is these places where in this time period, people would make important legal decisions for the city. So you imagine you've got Boaz, who's at the city gate, and just providentially, this other guy that could redeem Ruth and Naomi is walking by. Now, the ESV, it says, turn aside, friend. If you've got the King James translation, my favorite for this verse is the King James translation, where he says, ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. You notice that in both of these translations, but it's emphasized more so in the King James, where this guy is not named. Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. He just happens to be, and they got 10 important guys in the city, and they're about to do this important negotiation on who's going to get the girl and the land and everything. Little do these people know that what is being legislated right here, these negotiations right here, are some of the most important in terms of world history. And so here Boaz, and a lot of people call this other guy Mr. So-and-so because he's not named, and I think there's a reason for that. Mr. So-and-so sits down, and Boaz has to explain to him, okay, yeah, Naomi, her husband Elimelech, he has died, he had this land, and now she has it, and she's so destitute that she needs somebody to buy it so she can keep living on it, and something like, there's some of the details of that some people have debates about. Either way, the idea being that there's this opportunity for you, Mr. So-and-so, to buy this land. You're like, oh, great, a business opportunity. If I could acquire more land, this would be a very good business opportunity for me. And so he says, okay, I'll go ahead and redeem it. And as soon as he says that in verse 4, as readers, if you don't know the whole story, you're going, no, we want the help to come through Boaz. We don't know Mr. So-and-so. We don't care about Mr. So-and-so. We want it to be a love story between Ruth and Boaz. But look at what happens then in verses 5 and 6. Suddenly things change. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Mr. So-and-so is finding out here that if you're going to go ahead and buy this land, it also has to come as a package deal with the Moabite. And you have to have a child with this Moabite to perpetuate the dead name of this family. Or, as Genesis 38, verse 8 says very succinctly, without getting into all the context of that passage, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. In ancient Israel, if you had a couple that died and they never had kids, the brother-in-law had to have a wife, some relative had to have a kid with that wife to perpetuate the dead name. And so when this guy, Mr. So-and-so, finds out that that's what's going to have to happen, his concern here, this is going to impair my own inheritance. Not only am I going to have to pay the money for the land, which I was okay doing, but now I'm finding out that I got to take care of 2 widows and even have a kid with one of them, which means that this extra land that I get, I'm not going to be able to divvy it up amongst the kids that I already have. Now, I think we start to see why this guy's not named. Mr. So-and-so is more concerned about his family portfolio than he is actually helping 2 widows who are in need. Now, it seems like in this text he's got the option to say, I don't want to do that, but he's not proactively doing the noble thing here, which as readers, that's kind of what we all want to happen here because of Boaz and everything. But Mr. So-and-so's interest is self-serving. If it looks like I can help somebody else, but it's really helping me, then I will go ahead and do it, and it will be, a win-win and all that sort of thing, but it's really because of this benefit that I get from it. Reminds me of Proverbs 22, verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. Do you remember in Ruth chapter 1, Orpah, who just fell off the pages of Scripture when she doesn't go back with her mother-in-law? Well, there's another person like that in the book of Ruth, and that's Mr. So-and-so, who could have become, as we'll see later on in this lesson, part of one of the most important genealogies, the most important genealogy in world history. He had this opportunity, but because he didn't want to impair his own inheritance. Now ask yourself this question. Do you ever have opportunities to help other people and you go, you know what, that's going to hurt me too much? And of course, there's going to be times where you can't help people because you don't have the ability. But if you have the ability to help somebody and it's going to have to come at some amount of death to your bank account or some amount of death to your time or something like that, but you go, you know what, that wouldn't be best for my self-care or in my self-interest or for my inheritance or something like that. Do you think that God calls us to do more than that? A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than gold or silver. What good name? Ironically, in this story, Mr. So-and-so, who is never named, we don't know his name. But what he was concerned about was his name and his inheritance and passing on his legacy and all that kind of stuff at the cost of helping people that were right in front of him. Are you doing that right now? Now, with this negotiation then, Mr. So-and-so says no, and so now that opens up the gate for Boaz to be the one that's actually going to redeem Ruth. Now let's keep reading. Look at verses 7 through 10, where we get something like a wedding. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redemption and exchanging, to confirm a transaction. The one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." All right. We shake somebody's hand to seal a deal. Back then, somebody would remove his sandal and give it to you. And maybe there's something to this about, like, this foot can now tread on this land, and that's why we're exchanging a sandal. I don't know what all the details or all the reasons were for that, but this was like the ancient handshake. And this text emphasizes a couple times that there's witnesses seeing all of these things happen. And so now look what Boaz says, though. All right, everybody, I'm going to marry Ruth, and I'm going to take the land to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. You know, there's a lot of great Old Testament pictures of resurrection, of things that were dead or as good as dead, that came back to life. And you get a picture here of resurrection. This family was dead. This family was not going to have any continued inheritance in the land, but Boaz, the great Redeemer, has come, and now because of that, he's brought a resurrection to this family. But when Boaz says this, I'm marrying her to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, there's a very important thing to say about this, and I'm going to address specifically the single men here. When Boaz was going to marry Ruth, Boaz was marrying her in part of his motivation, part of his thinking was, I have something to offer you. There might be a lot of single guys that boast about wanting to have a housewife, and he wants her to cook good food for him, and that's what he wants. Okay, good for you. If that's what you want, that's great. But what are you doing to provide that for her? You can boast about that. Whenever people are thinking about possibly getting married, one of the things that is most common to be thinking about is, what am I going to get out of this relationship? And look at Boaz, who has been called a worthy man already in this book. That one of the things he's thinking in terms of is, what can I provide? What can I give? All right, so single guys, How many of you are living in a fake fantasy world right now? Where the only thing you do is play video games. Not inherently wrong to play video games, but it takes way too much of your time. And it's a fake world, and no girl is going to be really impressed with you if you get to level 30. She's not going to suddenly go, oh, wow, I really want to marry you now. So that's check one. You're spending 30 hours a week, 40 hours a week, wasting it on video games. And then secondly, you're also watching porn, which is also fake as well, not accomplishing anything in the real world. If you want to talk a big game about having such and such a kind of wife, but you're not having any kind of stable job to be able to provide a house for her, you're not giving her anything, then all you're doing is having empty, vain boasting. And I hope that the girl wouldn't be that shallow. Do you know what worthy people do in the book of Ruth? Worthy men provide rest for the woman. And worthy women have got the character and the conduct that would be attractive to a worthy man. Like attracts like in this book. And so much of male leadership in marriage has to do with you just being a moral person. You doing the right things. Which is what we've been seeing in Boaz. Now, notice something else in this passage. There's nothing said here about an elaborate wedding. And back then in this culture, they had week-long celebrations for weddings, and I looked it up this last couple weeks, that the average wedding right now costs about $30,000. If you ever looked at a godly married couple, you know, they've been married for like 75 years or whatever it's been, and you can interview them, and you say like, hey, what's made your marriage so great? And they go, well, we had a really good marriage ceremony. Like, I just feel like it got kicked off in the right way. This marriage, we spent like $80,000 on it, and that really set the tone for having such a great marriage. It said nobody ever. These people in this book, they've been preparing themselves for a solid marriage, not for a solid wedding day. Now, that's just a curiosity that I have in this passage. There's just not much said about a big, elaborate thing like that. But the transaction happens here. And you can imagine that for Ruth and Boaz, all of the trials, all of the difficulties that they've gone through, now there's a new day breaking because this godly man who has something to offer is giving her rest. Look what happens with those in the city. Look at verses 11 and 12. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. There's 3 blessings here. The first one given to Ruth. May you be like Rachel and Leah, who were very important for the history of God's people. We want the best for you, Ruth, the Moabite. Again, one of the things that we've seen throughout this book is when somebody's come from a very different kind of background. Let's say this next week, somebody in the community is baptized, and they've got tattoos all over them, they got piercings all over their face. How are we going to welcome somebody that's come from a background different than yours? And here, the city of Bethlehem is saying, we're rooting for you, Ruth. There's a blessing given to Boaz. May you act worthily and be renowned in Bethlehem. Boaz, we all acknowledge that you've done the right thing here. Then there's a blessing spoken to the lineage. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. And you go back to that story in Genesis 38, and it's odd because there's prostitution happening, there's sexual immorality. And I think the parallel here is that Tamar had her husband die, and so she had a child through somebody else, and that ended up becoming important for the nation. And may that similarity be the case for you, not so much the sinful part of this. But do you see that for the city here, how much interest the city of Bethlehem has in this marriage? How important is it to a local church that the marriages in a local church are healthy? That does something about future elders. That does something about for the deacons. How important is it that we're all interested, not in a weirdly invasive kind of way, but that we're interested that one another's marriages are what they ought to be? Look at this city and how much they're excited for these people. There's the redemption that takes place. But we end this chapter and we end the book of Ruth with this legacy that's borne out because of it. Look at verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. For 10 years, at the beginning of the book, when they were living in the land of Moab, Ruth didn't have any children. But now, for such a time as this, God has opened up her womb, and now she's had a child. If the book of Ruth opens up with funerals and death, it ends with marriage and children. It begins with a bleak outlook on life, and it ends with God providing them everything that they needed. The emptiness at the beginning of the book has been reversed at the end of the book, and here is Naomi, the mother-in-law, who had to see her husband die, her 2 children die, and now her daughter-in-law has stuck close to her. And all the women of the city are now praising Naomi. You can imagine Naomi holding this child, hearing the child cooing, like the baby's falling asleep on her lap. She is seeing something that she maybe never thought she would have seen in her life. And one of the things that I think we have to see with Naomi in this book is how God's providence, how God took care of her, has transformed her disposition. Do you remember at the beginning of the book when she told the people of the city, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." The name Mara means bitter. And she's saying, don't call me blessed, don't call me happy, call me bitter, because that's how I am. But then in chapter 2, when Boaz started to take care of Ruth, she says, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." In chapter 2, she's starting to bless the Lord. In chapter 3, she tells Ruth, "Should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" And that's where she gives her advice on how to go and propose to Boaz. Now I'm concerned about you. I've gotten outside of myself, and I'm concerned about you. And now in verse 14, where the women of the city say, "Blessed be the Lord, who's not left you this day without a redeemer." She does not rebuke these people. These people call her by her name, Naomi, in verse 17. She does not tell them to stop doing that. Now ask yourself this question. Have you gone through something very traumatizing and difficult at some point in your life? And it left you bitter, and you're still bitter, and you're never going to do this or that again. You're never going to date anybody again. You're never going to go to that store again. And it's just left these deep scars in you, and your bitterness has not ever left. Do you know what I think Naomi's been thinking about? God has taken care of me in ways that I never anticipated, and her eyes are fixated on what the Lord has done, and it's evaporated her bitterness. If you're a bitter person here this morning, ask yourself the question, why have you remained bitter? Have you not seen? Have you not looked, paid enough attention, meditated on what God has done for you? How is it that this transformation happened for Naomi? Now, the big answer to that is God has provided. But I want to draw your attention to one thing. God has provided a friend to Naomi in Ruth. They say in verse 15, that Ruth is more to you than 7 sons. Do you know how crazy that is to say that in that culture? 7 sons would be better than 7 daughters. 7 sons allows you to have your inheritance continue. And the women of the city say, this friend Ruth has been better to you than had you had 7 sons. What? And Ruth's name means friendship. So this morning, and probably last week when we were gone, there's people that have moved in maybe for their first time because they're going to WKU. This is an area of the country where people are moving into right now, and people are trying to figure out where they're going to go to church and all that sort of thing. You can enjoy the Bible classes and the sermons. You can enjoy the singing. You can be built up by it. You can be focused on the Lord like you wanted to, the Lord's Supper, all that kind of thing. Yes, all of that should be what it ought to be. But if you're doing all of that without close friends, I don't think the kind of transformation that you need in your life is really going to happen. Sociologists have said that in your life, you're fortunate to have 2 to 4 really close friends, the kind of people that you can share anything with. Do you know how lonely people feel right now in our country? Feeling like people don't care about you, people feeling like they don't notice you, people never asking you personal questions about anything in your life, and you just feel like you're part of a crowd and nobody's ever really there for you. One of the things that is the most important thing that God can provide in your life are close, spiritually minded friends. When was the last time that you tried to act friendly to somebody else, though? Because we could sit here and go, you know what, it would be nice to have a friend that's better than 7 sons, but I just don't know how I'm going to get that. Well, when was the last time you asked anybody about their life? When was the last time that you sought to be vulnerable with somebody else? When was the last time that you risked something for somebody else? In this room, we can be filled in a room of whatever, how many people are in here right now, and still feel lonely. Be proactive. Have people into your home, get to know people, share burdens with other people. And then I think that when you combine that with the Bible study, with the singing, with the Bible, with all those kinds of things, you'll have somebody that you can share all the things that you're learning with, and that'll bring transformation in your life. Who are your closest people? Notice, though, that in verse 14, these women are saying to Naomi, blessed be the Lord. Really? Blessed be the Lord? You don't know what's happened to me. My husband has died. My 2 sons have died. How dare you tell me to bless the Lord? But again, we see God's providence in what it does in somebody's life. I can look not just past the things in my life that I've lost, but God has brought me to this point now where I can say, blessed be His name because of how good He's been to me, because of the ways He's provided for me. It's been through fire. It's been through difficulty. But look what He's done. Look at verses 18 through 22. Before I read this, we're about to read a genealogy of 10 people. If Ruth opens up with 10 years of famine at the beginning of the book, it ends with 10 generations of blessing. Look at verses 18 to 22. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. This genealogy reaches towards David, leads towards David, who was in this time period that there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes, the days of the judges. And now it's going to be through these worthy people that God is going to bring a righteous king into the nation. And by the way, if David is part of this genealogy, that makes him part Moabite. Ask yourself this question. What kind of legacy are you leaving? The decisions you make now to not be Mr. So-and-so, the decisions you make now of not thinking just in terms of what will I get out of this marriage, but what am I going to provide to my wife, to my husband, to my children? When you start thinking in those kinds of ways and you start creating a link, I've talked to people before who didn't boast about this as if it made them righteous, but they were just thankful to God for it, that they could go back generations of fathers who were elders and so on and so forth, all this kind of stuff. Do you think that all happened by accident? Or do you think it happened because there was some couple that decided to make the right decisions together, and it changed generations to come? What are people going to say at your funeral? You know, Billy John really liked that NASCAR thing. You know, those cars kept taking those left turns. So he just really liked that. That's really cool. Or he just really liked football. All those rich guys fighting over a football that they could all afford and have their own, but they were all fighting over that ball, and he sure did really like that football stuff. What are people going to say at your funeral? I remember when I was in California, there was a woman that had passed on. And over all the seats at the funeral place were blankets. And I asked one of the family members, what are all these blankets? And they said, well, that's what she sewed for all the people in the family. Remember when Dorcas dies in Acts chapter 9? And people can bring tangible things commemorating Dorcas and what this woman did for me. What kind of legacy are you leaving? And if this story ended right here, this would be a beautiful love story. But if we scale back, we get this genealogy connecting to Jesus. And in Matthew chapter 1, there are 5 women listed in that genealogy. You've got Tamar, you've got Rahab, you've got Ruth, you've got Bathsheba, who's called the wife of Uriah there, and then you also have Mary. It wasn't common back then to have women listed in genealogies. It's not common to have a book in antiquity named after a woman. And look at the kind of people God uses who made decisions in their time. Some of them good, some of them bad. God uses these people to bring about the Messiah into the world. And through this bloodline that Ruth and Boaz became a link in, comes our ultimate rest as well. Revelation 19, verse 7, let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his bride has made herself ready. Just as Ruth and Naomi needed Boaz to provide rest for them, in a much greater way, we need Jesus to provide us ultimate rest. There's a hymn that we sometimes sing called There's a Great Day Coming. In the first part of it, there's a great day coming for those who are in Christ and they're going to be with him forever. But then there's another part of that song that says there's a sad day coming. When the sinner shall hear his doom, depart, I know ye not. There's a great day coming, there's a sad day coming. Jesus is coming as our knight in shining armor. He is the greater Boaz. He is the great Redeemer who will one day give you perfect rest if you will trust in him. Revelation 21, verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. You know those times in your life where you've gone through something difficult and God brought you through it in this life? You're not always guaranteed that. It might be the case that the rest of your life is going to have all kinds of pain and turmoil. But one day, all the former things will pass away, and it will be because of the great Boaz, the greater Redeemer. Do you see your need for him? Are you seeking him? We're about to sing this song, Take My Life and Let It Be, and that requires a lot of trust. A lot of trust. God, take my life. You do whatever you want with it. I'm not going to control my life anymore. Whatever you say, I'm going to do. I don't know better than you. In the back of your mind, you might be wondering, are you going to still take care of me? And we see in stories like Ruth that God's providence, as we seek him, all these things will be added to you. If there's anybody here that needs to become a Christian, they need to be married, betrothed to the greater Boaz, don't leave here without figuring out how to do that. Don't leave here without getting reconnected back to the Lord if that's been something that you've fallen away from. But if there's anything we can do for you, please come forward while we stand and while we sing.